Good afternoon. My name is Jay Hanley, Winnebago County State's Attorney. I'm here today to announce that there will be no criminal charges against Winnebago County Sheriff's Office deputies in relation to the April 10th, 2021 shooting death of Faustin Guetigo. To my right, I have Theo Glover, the chief of the Park District Police Department. He's also the chairman of the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force. To my left, your right, is Master Sergeant Chuck Davidson of the Illinois State Police. He is the commander of the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force. On April 10, 2021, Winnebago County Sheriff's deputies utilized deadly force against Faustin Guetigo. More specifically, deputies shot Guetigo and he died as a result of those gunshots. The Integrity Task Force conducted the investigation, and during their investigation, they interviewed witnesses, reviewed 911 calls, police radio transmission, in-car cameras, police body-worn cameras, cell phone records, surveillance video, photographs, police reports, medical records, and the results of forensic evaluations. The task force provided my office its final report of investigation pursuant to the Police and Community Relations Improvement Act. Contemporaneous to this press release and this press conference, I have issued a decision memorandum. That memorandum is to the people of Winnebago County, and its purpose is to provide an explanation of the facts of the incident, the legal principles involved, and the decision as to whether the deputies should be charged criminally for their actions that day. I understand that you have a deadline, and the news is tonight. I would strongly encourage you to read that memorandum. It is very detailed, and there are facts within that memorandum that I just won't cover today in this press conference. As detailed in the memorandum, I find that Sergeant Broullard and Deputy Eiten's use of force was justified, and they acted reasonably and lawfully. Therefore, no criminal charges are warranted. A criminal prosecution for either first or second degree murder would require proof beyond a reasonable doubt that deputies Broullard and Eiten were not legally justified in using deadly force against Guetigo. The key word is reasonable. In other words, a judge or jury would need to conclude that Sergeant Broullard or Deputy Eiten did not reasonably believe that they or others were in imminent danger of great bodily harm from Guetigo. Courts have recognized that the decisions officers make need to be made in a split second. The analysis is not a 20/20 analysis of what exactly should have happened, what the perfect situation was. Rather, it's whether the officer's belief was objectively reasonable. On Saturday, April 10th at approximately 11:30, sheriff's deputies responded to the Casey's at the corner of Mulford and Harrison, or near the corner of Mulford and Harrison. The victim, Rose Nadorium, told the deputy that her and her husband, Guetigo, had gotten into an argument at their apartment. She stated that Guetigo did not want their son, who had special needs, to live in their apartment. The victim told the deputy that Guetigo hit her with a closed fist. The deputy at the time observed the victim had a bloody lip. After that, the deputy took Rose back to the residence at 2191 Bellward. Guetigo was not at that residence. At approximately 5:45, deputies were called again to 2191 Bellward. Guetigo had come back to the home, had gotten into another argument and altercation with Rose, and Rose called 911. The first deputy made contact with Guetigo. He was alone at the time. Guetigo resisted arrest and went back into his residence. He came out a second time, resisted arrest again, and went back into his residence. Additional deputies arrived, and eventually the decision was made to enter the apartment to arrest Guetigo. As to Sergeant Broullard, when he arrived, he had the following information. He knew Guetigo had punched and choked Rose earlier the day, and that Guetigo was to be arrested for domestic battery. He also was made aware that Guetigo had resisted Deputy Coomer's attempts to arrest Guetigo. He also had the description of Guetigo as a black male wearing black pants, a blue t-shirt, and a green utility coat. Deputy Coomer had also advised that a 2-year-old child was believed to be with Guetigo in the apartment. When I'm talking about the residence or the apartment or the home, it was a duplex. There's a south residence and a north residence, and they are not accessible to one another. Deputies learned this, had cleared the southern residence, and it was believed, based upon Deputy Coomer's interactions with Guetigo, that he was in this north apartment. So again, the decision was made to enter the apartment and search for Guetigo and the child. They received the keys from Rose, and Sergeant Broullard was responsible or the leader of the effort to go inside of the home. Taking a little aside here, most of the facts, as I've described and we'll describe today and even the memorandum, were taken primarily from the reports of the officers and the body cam evidence. And so I'm going to talk about Sergeant Brouillard's perspective, what he indicated in his report, and what the body cam footage shows of what happened inside of that residence. Brouillard states in his report that an arrest team was set up at the door nearest the garage. He opened the door with the keys given. Deputy Kempen had his taser out, while Sergeant Brouillard had his weapon in his left hand. Deputy Fay was the third deputy in the line, and he was open-handed for the arrest team. Deputy Fay was announcing police loudly before they entered the home. Sergeant Brouillard announced the sheriff's department, and he entered the home. Although Kempen went in first with his taser and moved to the left towards the kitchen area, Sergeant Brouillard followed behind him and observed a door in front of him. That was the basement door. He opened that door and observed Guetigo at the bottom of the stairs. Guetigo had matched the description of what had been provided to Sergeant Brouillard earlier. The man was wearing black pants and a neon utility work jacket. Sergeant Brouillard saw that he had a long metal object in his hand that appeared to be a bat, pipe, or some type of sword machete. He stayed at the top of the stairs and began to yell loudly, "Let me see your hands, drop it, drop it." Deputy Fay was also giving similar commands. According to Brouillard, there was sufficient lighting and no barriers such that Guetigo would have seen the deputies at the top of the stairs, including Sergeant Brouillard. Guetigo did not comply with those commands and aggressively moved up the stairs. He pointed at Sergeant Brouillard and said no, and then moved up the stairs, raising the weapon above his head. Brouillard states that based upon his training and experience, he believed that that weapon could cause great bodily harm to him or other deputies. He felt that there was limited space between him, Guetigo, and the other deputies, and knew that Guetigo would be in a position very quickly to strike him or the other deputies. Sergeant Brouillard began to fire his firearm to stop the attack. According to Brouillard, he fired an unknown amount of times at the suspect, and he continued to advance without stopping. According to Brouillard, it seemed that the gunfire had no effect on Guetigo. He continued to advance and struck me with his weapon twice, once on the right hand and once on the head. He says that his vision went completely black, all the strength left his body, and he went unconscious. He has limited memory of what occurred after being struck. He does remember being assisted into a car and taken to the hospital. He also remembers that his head was bleeding at that time. As for Deputy Eiten, who also fired his firearm, when deputies lined up to enter the residence, he was towards the back, really the fourth deputy. As he was lined up at the basement door, he could not see inside of the home, but could hear deputies ordering someone to show their hands. He heard the deputies yelling, "Drop it," several times, and he heard what sounded like a person running up the stairs. His view was blocked, but he also believes he may have heard tasers being discharged. Suddenly, the deputies in front of him backed into him, causing him to not be outside of the front door towards the breezeway. He saw a male subject through the glass window with a fluorescent arms and making a striking motion towards another deputy. He could see, meaning Deputy Eiten could see a long object in this person's hands and could hear screaming and yelling as well as gunfire. He felt at that moment that the subject's actions could result in great bodily harm to that deputy. He drew his service weapon, pointed it at Guetigo, and fired one round through the glass window. Sergeant Broullard, after the incident, Sergeant Broullard was taken to the hospital where he received medical attention for a contusion and laceration to the left side of his head. He received 9 stitches and had lingering effects for months following the incident. Guetigo was pronounced dead at the hospital. On the following Monday, April 12th, Dr. Peters, the pathologist for Winnebago County, performed an autopsy of Guetigo. He provided Guetigo's cause of death as gunshot wounds of chest and abdomen. The autopsy revealed 8 gunshot wounds, one to each to Guetigo's right arm, left chest, right upper thigh, right lateral thigh, left back, and left hand. Sergeant Broullard and Deputy Eaton's firearms were taken into evidence at the hospital. The evidence demonstrated that Sergeant Broullard fired his weapon 11 times and Deputy Eiten fired his once. Based upon the number of gunshot wounds that Guetigo suffered, it is a reasonable assumption that Sergeant Broullard shot Guetigo at least 7 times and possibly 8. This is consistent with Sergeant Broullard firing 11 times, his proximity to Guetigo, and the number and location of the casings and projectiles recovered at the scene. The body cam footage and physical evidence gathered at the crime scene are inconclusive as to whether Deputy Eiten struck or shot Guetigo. Based upon the totality of the circumstances, Sergeant Broulard's belief that it was necessary to shoot Guetigo to protect himself and other deputies from great bodily harm was reasonable. When Sergeant Broullard first saw Guetigo, he was coming up the basement stairs with a large object raised in his right hand. He believed it to be a bat, pipe, sword, or machete. Any of these objects could inflict great bodily harm. Despite multiple commands to stop, Guetigo to continue to go up the stairs with the pipe still raised. At that moment, Sergeant Broullard believed, based upon his experience and training, that Guetigo could inflict great bodily harm to him or other deputies. This belief was objectionably reasonable because this perceived threat of great bodily harm became a reality. Despite being shot multiple times, Guetigo continued to run up the stairs and struck Sergeant Broullard twice with a 2.5-foot metal pipe. One of those strikes did in fact inflict great bodily harm, as Sergeant Broulard's head was seriously wounded. Further, his decision that it was necessary to use deadly force, specifically to fire his gun to stop Guetigo, was reasonable. In short, an officer may use deadly force to stop another's use of force, which could cause great bodily harm or death. That is exactly what Sergeant Broullard did. As the body cam footage makes clear, and as Sergeant Broullard stated, it was as if the bullets had no effect on Guetigo. He continued to charge up the stairs and hit me twice. This demonstrates that deadly force was necessary to stop the attack. As to Deputy Eiten, it's the same conclusion. Based upon the totality of the circumstances, his belief that shooting Guetigo was necessary to protect himself and other deputies from great bodily harm was reasonable. He was in the back of the line, and he heard what sounded like a person running up the stairs. While he had not yet seen Guetigo, at this point he had not yet seen Guetigo, and he was backed into by other officers calling him back, forcing him back into the breezeway. Deputy Eiten saw Guetigo flailing his arms in a striking motion and forcing his way towards deputies while he was doing this. He further stated that he saw a long object in Guetigo's hand. At the same time, Deputy Eiten heard screaming and gunfire. Based upon what he saw and heard, Deputy Eiten stated that he believed in that moment Guetigo's actions would result in great bodily harm or death to another deputy. He drew his firearm and fired one round at Guetigo, shattering the glass window. His belief was reasonable. Through what he heard, he understood Guetigo to be resisting with some type of object in his hand. Next, his recitation of what he saw demonstrates that he believed Guetigo was attacking another deputy. This belief was reasonable because that is in fact what was happening. Guetigo was attacking Sergeant Broullard, twice striking him with a metal pipe. His decision to use deadly force to fire his gun was reasonable because Guetigo's use of force threatened great bodily harm, particularly to Sergeant Broullard. Deputy Eiten was justified in using deadly force. A few comments. My review was to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. It is not a determination of whether an officer may have violated police or department policy or whether civil, non-criminal laws had been violated. Further, the investigation having been completed and there being no criminal charges authorized, the investigation materials will be made public. It is this office's understanding that the Illinois State Police will release the video evidence and other reports pursuant to the Illinois Freedom of Information Act. This morning I met with Guetigo's family and notified them of my decision and answered any questions that they had. They were provided the decision memorandum. I would like to acknowledge the deputies involved, and specifically Deputy Broullard. He was seriously injured during the incident and was forced to take another man's life in the line of duty. These are two things this community doesn't want our law enforcement officers to have to face. Lastly, I would like to commend the task force for its professional and thorough investigation of this incident. Any questions?